Hello and welcome back to Child Development Training for Hub Leaders. In this video, I'm going to look at a series of broad themes that help us to build up a critical perspective towards child development. The first of these will be around touching on the difficulty of defining the brain or the mind. Then we'll look at how do we understand people, community, and relationship in the context of child development, followed by how do we understand experience and context in the understanding of child development in contrast to scientific understandings. Then we touch on behaviour and internalization as two important dynamics involved in understanding child development. Then we look at measurement, some of the challenges and concerns involved in measuring development. We spent some time looking at children's perspectives in this regard, and then finally, having looked at a lot of very complex questions, how do we then go about acting in the space of child development, knowing that we'll never have full and final knowledge on the area. So firstly, in terms of definitions, is it possible to accurately define the brain and its processes, to define the mind, and thus to be able to define development? We can speak about the brain and the mind in many different ways, and there's been a number of theories that have been developed which don't always blend in well, or for the most part do not blend in well with each other. We're not even sure of our name for the brain or the mind. We keep talking about the brain or the mind. Where is the mind? We know where the brain is, but then we talk about this thing called a mind. So there's confusion at a very fundamental level for us in how do we define this thing that produces our consciousness and our thoughts. And then there's the question, somewhat philosophical question, I suppose, how far and by what means can a thinking subject know itself? And the analogy here is that an eye can only see itself by way of a reflecting device such as a mirror. So a brain perhaps cannot directly understand what a brain is by virtue of being one already. We need reflecting devices of some nature to help us to understand it. And in our perspective, in our context, it'll be theories or concepts which we use to try to understand and explain it. The next thing for us to understand is around people and communities of people and the role of relationship. So unlike the scientific assumptions we follow whenever we're trying to develop a scientific theory, people aren't actually isolated subjects. They do exist in community, and they're shaped irrevocably by relationships. That just can't be avoided. There's the concept of embodied perception, that our bodies and our senses actually connect us to other people in ways that are largely pre-conscious. And Merleau-Ponty, the philosopher, suggests that this is easily evidenced by infants who identify with other people, their primary caregivers, well before the time when they are forming a clear sense of themselves, which is perhaps a contestable view, given we can't tell for sure what an infant is experiencing. But the behaviour seems to suggest that infants are relating to other people much earlier than they're relating to themselves. Then beyond the sensory field, there's the area of linguistics and psychology, language and consciousness. People are woven together in relationships through symbolic understandings which are shared, through experiences and memories which are shared. This symbolic relationship between people is extremely powerful. And so drawing on all of this, we have to understand that when we're working with children and working in the space of child development, it's really important to understand what's going on for those children in terms of their relationships with their parents or their primary caregivers, their relationships with other people within and outside the family, and how involved are their parents and others in the growth and development of the child. So one area that aims to explicitly explore this and map that out is bioecology, which was developed largely through the work of Urie Bronfenbrenner in mapping out the connections surrounding an individual. Here's an image derived from Bronfenbrenner's work. It's kind of an augmented version of his original model of bioecology. It's got some additional components for the modern day around technological subsystems impacting on individuals in the modern day. But the principles of this are basically the same, that with each individual at a particular centre, there's a various layers of systems around them which influence them. And there's a simple quote here from Bronfenbrenner: "The main effects are in the interaction." It's one very basic statement which more or less sums up the thrust of his work. Then we look at experience and context, and we come down to, I guess, a very practical statement that life is lived experientially. We only learn in context, in a particular context. And that might seem like common sense, but it's remarkable that this notion of life and knowledge being related to context is remarkably absent from a modern Western perspective of the world, a scientific perspective of the world, which aims to abstract out from experience to achieve universal knowledge and universal principles. We really don't have very many working concepts for how to relate knowledge to experience and context in our philosophical landscape in Western society. In fact, probably the most helpful exponent of the experiential perspective is Aristotle, who was around quite a long time ago, and we haven't really moved on from or developed from the ideas that he initiated about 2,500 years ago around this subject. Aristotle worked in one of his works on the Nicomachean Ethics, or the Ethics, on defining various forms of human intelligence. And there were three in particular that he spoke about in terms of intelligences that are available to humans. One of those was scientific knowledge, or in the Greek, episteme. One of those was technical knowledge, how to do things and build things and create things in the world, and he called that techne. And then there was the area of practical wisdom, or prudential wisdom, which he called phronesis. And this phronesis is the experiential knowledge, or the contextual knowledge of everyday life. It's the common sense knowledge. Now, he had an interesting perspective on this. He was a student of Plato, who held scientific knowledge as the pinnacle, and Western society has certainly taken Plato's view on things. But what Aristotle said was, yes, scientific knowledge is universal and infinite and perfect, but unless it's applied in context, it's useless to humans. And so he actually held that phronesis, practical knowledge, was the most important area of knowledge for humans. Why does this matter? Because when we're looking at child development, we're often drawing from scientific studies. And when we're working with children, we're working with individuals in a particular context. And so in child development, in a lot of other areas, we try to correlate the experiential observations and the contextual knowledge we obtain in working with people with abstract scientific knowledge and statistics and so forth. It actually isn't a straightforward relationship between these two. And perhaps very few people understand that. So we need to think in terms of on the one hand, we have our experience and individual context and particular facts. On the other hand, we have scientific knowledge, which is an abstraction of a lot of different facts and a lot of different experiences into some kind of statistical format, which in a statistical format don't actually relate to any one individual. So what I would suggest is there's a limit to using science and statistics to understand how individual children or individual people actually function, and that we need to put our own experience within context through continuous learning as the forefront of our approach to understanding children and child development. Behaviour and internalisation is another broad theme. So I guess it's fairly clear to see that behaviour is fairly explicit, observable. We can measure certain behaviours, and much of our understanding of people, particularly of young children and infants, derives from our observations of behaviour. Because we have virtually no memory of being a baby, we rely on behaviours of babies almost exclusively to understand how babies function. But then there's the area of internalized developments. These tend to be observed only very indirectly or intuitively by people who know children quite well. But the relationship between internalization and behavior is very important to understanding child development. We'll be looking at this more in a future video. Measurement in child development is a very tricky area, and there's some critical perspectives to bring into play here. Optimizing people and optimizing minds is perhaps one of the ways that child development aims to operate in terms of working with children. What is our frame of reference in trying to optimize a child's development? So often we are looking at some specific aspects of development, such as literacy and numeracy, which are quite functionally important in terms of education and employment in future life, but is by no means holistic to the developmental needs of the child. So when we look at our priorities in child development, we need to be very careful. And if we're only picking things that we can easily measure, that's not to say that the things that we can't measure are not important. It's more that the system that we're using is favouring measurable elements of development. We also need to understand distinctions in measurement. A very basic form of measurement is simply observing and describing things that happen. We can then evaluate what we've seen. We can explore the meaning of what we've seen and evaluated. Beyond this, we can start to make inferences from fairly basic common sense inferences right up to fairly sophisticated statistical inferences about why something has happened, what might have caused this. And then we come to causation, which I guess is the gold standard for science. It's being able to scientifically demonstrate that something has caused something else. In working with children and in doing child development work, if we're going to want to measure and evaluate what we're doing, we need to think about what level we want to operate at on this scale. Inference and causation are quite complex in this environment, quite hard to do without specialist knowledge and a lot of resources. Is it going to be acceptable to everyone if we stick to the level of evaluation, coming up with common sense understandings of what we've seen? In a lot of programs, this is actually what happens. And then beyond this scale of measurement, there's actually a space where I believe measurement doesn't work, and this is in highly complex contexts, which do come up in child development reasonably frequently, where we need to learn as we go. We cannot simply build a base of knowledge of some contexts and then just carry on with that. We're always learning within the context. And so our evaluation or our measurement would constantly be changing with that. So this isn't great news for people who want to measure things and have scientific explanations for child development. So beyond all of those themes, we come to what I feel is perhaps the most important one. What do children actually want? And by that I mean, what do children need for their development? I don't think there's too much of a difference in those two questions. And do we ask children what they want? A lot of the time, we don't. And how do we go about then capturing the voice and the perspective of children? Do we have mechanisms for listening to children and responding to their perspectives in the work that we do? This is a very important question. I encourage everyone involved in child development to look at this. So does our thinking and planning match the actual needs and interests of children? It's a great question to ask and to keep asking. Some of the research that's been undertaken into this comes up with some fairly general themes, which are possibly likely to come up again in any local investigations that you do. But basically, what children seem to be looking for is reliable adults in their lives to provide safety and support and attention, embodied love, which is contact, hugs, and so forth. And then environments for play or exploration or discovery are down there, but it's the relationship and the connection to somebody reliable, which seems to be the common thread a lot of the time in studies of children's voices on what they want. So I've touched very briefly on a number of quite complex themes here. Hopefully I haven't made a mess of describing them all, but at the end of all this, it's easy to see that you could overthink child development and tie yourself up in a knot and decide this is all too hard. I don't know how to proceed with this. But we actually have to proceed. Even if we don't know everything, and we never will know everything about child development or about children, we have to do something. The children are there and they need our input. So what do we do with that? Well, understanding children's needs and perspectives will help us. Understanding some of the theory around development will help. And knowing some practical ways of engaging children in learning activities is going to help. So if we keep developing our awareness of those three areas, that's going to be useful over time. But we're going to have to make decisions without full knowledge. We're going to have to draw on a values base to do that. And what should our values look like? Well, what do we believe children need in order to have the best possible opportunities for development? And how do our own experiences shape the way that we think and act in this regard? This is something, again, that we will never perfect, but we need to keep looking at this. Are we understanding where we're coming from in terms of our own perspective on childhood and development? And are we genuinely listening to the children and the families that we're working with in order to do this work? I believe that if we have a strong values base and a clear values base, which aligns with the community we're working with and the children we're working with, and if we follow the areas of pursuit in understanding children's needs, understanding theory, and understanding the practical ways to engage children in development, then that's pretty much the best we can do in our context. So that's a very quick snapshot of some broad themes to help us shape the rest of the training. And we'll move on next to looking at some specific theories of child development.